Liftport Group. We've been doing these shows for about 4 months now, so thanks for everybody for being a part of this. Each week we do things a little bit different because we're kind of test marketing or testing kind of three formats. Anybody who knows me knows I'm pretty interested in space policy. We're going to talk about that quite a bit tonight. We tend to have guests about half the time, so pretty happy about that. We just had Matthew Travis from Aphelion Aerospace on our show on Monday. We've got Dr. Namrata Goswami coming up. We've had a schedule change. I'll tell you about that in a moment, but she's scheduled for the 20th. And then the final thing that we've been doing is kind of space news, right? What's been happening in the news, and doing some analysis, a little bit of analysis behind it. It's been pretty fun. We've been doing this for a couple months now, twice a week, Mondays and Wednesdays typically. We're now starting to kind of ramp them up, putting them into podcast format so you can listen to them at your leisure. So little by little, the parts are starting to come together. So pretty happy about this. Pretty happy about the shift and the growth and the change that has been happening. So stick with us. We've had some good news recently. We're going to share that news probably in another week or so. But we've had some good news, so pretty happy about that. We're actually trying to do the work to justify the good news, so just be patient with us a little bit longer on that. It's a little unconfirmed, but I will be going to Washington. I expect to be going to Washington, D.C. next week. I'm not really sure what that's going to do to our broadcasting schedule. We may cancel it, we may do something short, or we may have somebody filling in. So a little bit TBD on what happens next week while I'm traveling. But I'll be going to Washington, D.C., and there's a bunch of lobbying that gets done. So I'm really excited about that. I did it a long time ago, back in 2004 and 2005. It's terrific getting out there and meeting the various congressmen and senators from all the states. All the states have value and importance to the space sector. So we wound up going to Capitol Hill, and there's a whole community of us. I don't know, I think there's going to be 40 or 50 people, which is about twice what it was the last time I did this. I think people are really excited about being able to do it. The space community does this every year. It's informally, it's called March Storm. I think there's a more formal name for it, but I confess I don't actually know what that more formal name is. And there's kind of three topics that they're tackling. Planetary defense, asking for $200 million to do a planetary defense survey, satellite. 25 million looking for a test for space-based solar power. That's actually, honestly, the main reason I'm going. Back in 2004, 2005, I was expressly forbidden to talk about space-based solar power or space elevators. And you remember, I was actively working on the space elevator back in those days. So it's kind of funny how nearly 20 years later, they're like, not only can they say it, they're actively pitching space-based solar power. So I'm pretty excited about that. For those folks that don't know me very well, the reason I got into space in the first place was space-based solar power. The possibility of clean, green, limitless energy beamed to the 300 largest cities of the world effectively gives 40% of the global population clean, green, limitless energy, and I think that's something worth fighting for. It's the reason I got into space elevator work, actually, because we wanted to do space-based solar power, but the rocketry at the time in 2001, 2, and 3, the rocketry wasn't strong enough, and so we kind of abandoned the idea of space-based solar power for a long time. Fortunately, folks have been keeping that fire burning, or at least the embers warm, for 20 years. And now with our new capabilities in rocketry globally, I think we have a real shot at being able to do space-based solar power. Also, it's one of the reasons why we want to build an elevator on the moon, specifically so we can build a construction site at the Lagrange point using lunar resources for the big elements, the raw elements, and ship those panels from the Lagrange point back towards Seattle or Washington, D.C., or Moscow, or any of the other great cities of the world. So that's where I'm going next week. I'm going to Washington, D.C. The third thing that they're focusing on, this policy effort, is there has been a rule called a learning period that the FAA has instigated that basically says, the industry asked the FAA for a learning period that basically says, give us 8 years for this space tourism. And I think everybody knows I don't like that phrase very much, but that's a popular pop culture phrase, so I continue using it. Give us 8 years for this new industry of space tourism to take off. Let's learn what we need to learn. Let's figure out what the rules should be. Let's not put boxes and barriers around this brand new industry. Well, that rule set is about to expire. It's been in place for a long time. Candidly, the industry didn't grow as fast as the original crafters of this idea expected. But this learning period has history. We did it with the internet. We actually did it in the early days of aviation, although it was not officially called a learning period at that time. But during the internet days, it was called a learning period. And it basically says, let's take this new industry, let's give it some free rein, let's let them figure out what's important, let's have some errors, let's make some mistakes, figure out what we as the federal government need and don't need to have our fingers in. And the reality is, this industry, this suborbital tourism industry, or point-to-point that's hoped for, those things haven't grown as fast as people had hoped. It's kind of right in line where I thought it was going to be. I've always been a curmudgeon about the space tourism industry. But the request to the FAA is like, hey, let's give it 8 more years and see what happens. And I think that's really prudent. A friend of mine, Rand Simberg, wrote a book that says failure is an option. And it is basically an indictment of the industry saying, life, health, safety at all costs, even to the point of wrecking potential missions. But if you look back at the early days of air travel, those were pretty rough and tumble cowboy days. A lot of people died in those early days of air travel. And so if you have this ethos of failure is not an option, it means you have to massively, massively over-engineer everything. And maybe not everything needs to be over-engineered. Maybe some things can be partially over-engineered or not over-engineered at all. So that safety ethos, it's great because very few people have died in this industry so far. I think only 3. Not trying to throw not trying to throw Virgin under the bus, but they had 2 people die in a refueling accident and 1 in a flight accident. So I think those are the only 3 that I can think of off the top of my head. There might be more, but I'm not aware of any. So those are the 3 things that we're going to go to Washington, D.C. We're going to talk about planetary protection. Candidly, I know absolutely nothing about planetary protection, so I'm going to let the other smart people in the room tackle that. There is going to be a session where we learn a little bit about that. And then there's going to be space-based solar power. I don't know who was going to get that $25 million, if it gets appropriated, if it gets approved. I don't know if that's going to be a NASA-directed experiment. I don't know if the commercial sector is going to be able to tackle that. I certainly hope so. I am fans of people in this industry that have been working on this for a long time. I think everybody who has watched any of our shows go back in time, maybe 2 years ago, Dr. John Mankins. I'm a big fan of what Mankins has done in the industry. He has dedicated his life to space-based solar power the way that I have dedicated mine to elevators, both on the Earth originally and then on the moon now. So I hope that money becomes available for him and other people like him, because there are actually, I learned just recently, there are some funded stealth space-based solar power companies, which I'm pretty amazed at. I worked at one very briefly. It was a terrible experience in my career. So I know how hard it can be to start a business on this idea. So fingers crossed. I'm going to root for the industry, not necessarily for a particular winner. And then the FAA learning period. So that's what I'm going to go to Washington, D.C. for. It'll be Monday, Wednesday, Thursday, and Friday. Doing another project with the Space Frontier Foundation while I'm out there. I'll share the details about that once I return. And that's next week. So I don't know what our schedule is going to be for a show Monday and Wednesday. Part of my team wants to cancel it. Part of my team wants to do it. We haven't decided. More than likely, it won't be me. So that'll be a chance for my valued and respected team to get a little bit more airtime, screen time. So I think that's maybe the way we're going to go. I've got my fingers crossed about that, but that decision hasn't been made yet. Okay, so we talked a little bit about space-based solar power. We're going to switch gears. This is more of a policy conversation, but real hat tip to my friend Peter Gerritsen. So we're going to talk about Gerritsen for a bit. Before we do that, I want to point out 2 pieces of news. I think they're pretty important. One, this is fantastic. I'm a big fan of Dr. Faust. I have been for a long time. He's a terrific reporter. He has another site called Space Review that's longer format articles. Some of the smartest people in the industry write for Jeff on a Space Review site. But this caught my eye because, one, this system looks a lot like the original lift port ship that we designed for the space elevator, the Earth-based space elevator. I was pretty surprised by this. So I started looking into it, Spaceport Company, and now I'm starting to clue into what this is. And then this part made me smile and laugh out loud. What they're trying to do is build spaceports out in the ocean, so there's less safety requirements, less restrictions, and launch kind of like Sea Launch did a bunch of years ago, but this is kind of the new and improved version. But the thing that made me so happy was this guy, Tom Murata. Tom used to work for me back when he was maybe 22, I think. That was nearly 20 years ago. He's in his high 30s, early 40s now. Has had a terrific career. Uh, Went off and did work for the State Department for a while. Did some work in Iraq and Afghanistan for a while. Was a career State Department officer for a while. Then went on to the FAA, and he worked in the commercial launch sector at the FAA for probably 5 years when all of this stuff was starting to happen. What we're going to talk about later in a few minutes about the Starship Singularity, Tom was seeing it firsthand how the world was changing every day, that there were more and more launches, that they didn't have enough people at the FAA's commercial launch sector. So Tom started as an intern. I believe it was his very first job. I'm pretty sure that was true. So to see him coming out and becoming the chief executive of his own company and creating something new, and the idea of, let's go build spaceports so that we can launch more rockets. I think that's fabulous. I'm so excited for him. I haven't had a chance to talk to him about this yet, but I guarantee you I'm going to be making some phone calls, and while I'm in DC, I'm going to try and meet up with him. So pretty happy about this. I'll post the article in the chat. You can take a look at it. So pretty happy about what's going on with Tom. And there's an element of the Starship Singularity in this, in that just our guest the other day, we were talking, Matthew, we were talking about how there's 200 launch companies out there right now. He says only 20 will make it. I think it's going to be more than that. I think it's going to be 40 or north of 40 even. I don't think it's 200, but I think it's north of 40. And the idea of having a portable sea-based launch pad is really intriguing, because here's the thing. Where do you put a spaceport next to New York City? You can't. Where do you put a spaceport next to Beijing? You can't. Not with safety elements, but a giant portion of the global population is located around the oceans, right? Ports and trains. Those are the things that bind us all together. So the idea of Murata focusing on a sea-based launch capability, that's pretty darn cool. And I didn't see it coming. I'm not going to pretend that I did. But as soon as I saw it, it just made perfect sense to me. And keep that in mind when we talk about the rest of the Starship Singularity that's coming. And then the other piece of news that also hit this week, I'm going to post a link here. This one also caught me totally off guard. And frankly, this one shouldn't have. This one probably I should have seen coming. The idea, and I'd love to know who the sources are, I'd love to know who that is, but the idea that United Launch Alliance might be up for sale, that's a big piece of industry news. That is a game changer from the industry perspective. It's especially interesting because it might be one of the first real indications of the Starship Singularity that we're going to talk about in a minute. But for those who don't know, and I'm being a little bit sarcastic here, just bear with me, but United Launch Alliance has been described as an unholy alliance between Northrop Grumman and Boeing to jointly create rocket solutions. And if there's ever been, if you understand the difference between new space and old space, ULA represents old space. And that's not for me to say that they're terrible, because they actually have a tremendously strong track record. Super expensive. That expense arguably comes from their reliability and testing. It goes back to the argument a minute ago about, how safe is safe enough. And ULA has had a tremendous track record, especially for military and national security uh, contracts. So that they are maybe in trouble, that they are maybe up for sale. And again, we don't have this verified and confirmed yet, but the idea that they might be up for sale, and that, Jeff Bezos might be how this unfolds, I think that's pretty remarkable. ULA has had a monopoly on launching national security missions and science probes, right? So in return for 100% success, ULA received a large launch contracts worth $1 billion annually to maintain launch readiness, right? Pretty not a bad business if you can get it. But the truth is, the rest of the story is that launch costs are changing, providers are changing, you're expanding into new markets, new territories, new suppliers to those markets and territories. So, and also, because of Russia, ULA had been buying some engines from Russia for a while. They didn't want that uncertainty. This all predates the Russian invasion of Ukraine. This is actually going back a couple of years now. But Blue Origin took on a contract to start building ULA engines. So, so that the idea that Amazon might be the purchaser of ULA, that certainly adds to speculation. And Blue contracted, has one of the largest contracts in aerospace history. I think it's something like 60 launches or 70 launches over the next 5 or 8 years. That also points to maybe and it wasn't, I want to be clear, it was Amazon that made that pre-purchase agreement, not Blue Origin. Mostly because they just needed a ride. They've got satellites sitting in warehouses that want to go to the sky. So, so all of that kind of like flows together. And again, I think this is an outcome of what we're going to talk about for the rest of the next hour, is this Starship Singularity, right? That, and we've had a show on the Starship Singularity before. I'm going to stop sharing here and move on to something else. Just a moment. So you've heard me talk about the Starship Singularity many times now. The phrase was invented on our show. Maybe it was 2 years ago, a little over 2 years ago now. And my friend here, Garrett, and I have been talking about for a long time. Michael Mealing at Starbridge Capital has been talking about for a long time, and I've been talking about for a long time. So this is the first paper, actual document paper that has come out focused on Starship Singularity. I'm pretty happy that I'm like the very first, where is it? I'm the very first note. So thanks for that, Garrettson. I appreciate that. It's always nice to get credit. But I want to point out that this has always been bigger than me. So I had some friends that were concerned that maybe I'd be upset about him getting his paper out. I've been working on one off and on for half a year now, and honestly have not put that much effort into it. So it was completely fine, and I've known for a long time that Peter was working on this. So not only am I not mad, I'm really pleased and proud that he's gotten this out into the world, because it's really important. And for those who have gotten glimpses of my paper already, my plan was not to have the definitive answer of what the Starship Singularity was going to be. My plan was to build a framework and then invite a variety of authors to contribute. I was going to ask them for 2 or 3 pages, and Garrettson's like, that's not enough. I got 10 pages in me, and that's what this document is. So I really want to recommend that you take a look at this. I'm going to post a link in a moment. I've had a chance to look at this. So I want to kind of differentiate. What I want to do for my paper is to look at this very holistically. I don't think that the story is just about SpaceX, which is why I preceded this with sea-based launch ports and United Launch Alliance maybe being for sale because they're having a hard time competing. I think this goes way beyond the single organization of SpaceX and a single rocket. I think this has global implications, national security implications. Peter goes into that a lot with this document. It has transportation and logistics implications. The whole launch rocketry industry is going to change. And it's all, to me, it's almost like when we built the Transcontinental Railroad system, it wasn't about the locomotive. It was someone from New York City could get to San Francisco in 3 days. It was mail that could get back and forth. It was wheat and hogs and cattle. It was what allowed for not the first gold rush in California, but the second gold rush up in Alaska that populated Seattle. All of those things were enabled. Well, maybe not quite the same. The gold rush in Seattle, the time frame doesn't track. So ignore that last sentence. But it wasn't about the thing that we call a locomotive. It was the infrastructure, the transportation infrastructure that changed North America, the rest of the globe, and it shrunk the planet, right? That's, to me, the big takeaway. So, Garrettson's written this from a national security, national policy perspective, but I also think it goes to research and development, it goes to medicine, it goes to computing, communications, material sciences. We're going to see breakthroughs in every sector of the world. And we're never going to think about, here's that locomotive that was so cool. No, it's going to be the global transportation system that's going to change. And by changing the global transportation system, we take air flight for granted now, and eventually, maybe not yet, but eventually we're going to take space travel for granted. And it's not very far away. So really want to encourage you to take a look at this document. Let me post a link here in just a moment. So let's talk about Garrettson before we get into his document. I'm going to try and get him on our show. I was hoping I was going to be able to get him actually tonight. Nevertheless, pardon me. Despite not being able to get him on the show, I thought this document was kind of too important to just let sit. So I wanted to kind of tackle it. Pardon me. So let's dig into this a little bit further. Peter is a retired lieutenant colonel from the Air Force. I've known him both in his active duty days and as a civilian. I'm fortunate that I have had some really cool instructors, and I'm always kind of in this learning phase. Garretson, Lieutenant Colonel, at the time, active duty, Lieutenant Colonel Garretson, Major Sean McLean, 3-star General Stephen Quast, the Chief Scientist of U.S. Space Force, Dr. Joel Mosier, Colonel Eric Felt at the Air Force Research Lab. I'm sure I'm forgetting some people, but these folks, as active duty military officers, really opened my eyes to an idea that sometimes described as a blue water versus brown water ethos. And what that means is, using military analogies, I'm a former U.S. Marine. Marines are a function of, are a component of the U.S. Navy. Marines operate in this littoral region, this region right next to the land. Okay, we're kind of just dead weight if we're out in the deep middle of the Pacific or the Atlantic. Where the Marines really thrive and the jobs they're trained to do is near the shore, near shore operations. And that's sometimes called littoral, or sometimes that's called brown water operations, as opposed to a submarine, which spends most of its time, yeah, it has to dock, but most of its time out in the deep, dark blue ocean. Moving around silently, carefully, and you use those two tools, the Marines and the submarines, very, very differently, right? And so this idea has come in to kind of modern pop culture in the Pentagon, a blue water versus a brown water philosophy, and the brown folks, they won. I mean, nobody doubts that. The whole Space Force knows that it's kind of run by, controlled by folks that are focused on the near shore. And what does that mean? That means low Earth orbit, mid Earth orbit, geosynchronous orbit. That is the area that they are paying attention to. And I get it. I understand why. That's really important. And we just saw China a couple days ago announce that they're going to send up a 13,000 satellite network. And one of the main reasons they're doing it is to actively deny SpaceX and Kuiper and OneWeb of getting access to those orbits. And there's argument. They think they can deploy faster. I think that's pretty unlikely, but it's possible, if you nationalize the workforce. So we've got this blue water versus brown water philosophy. The Browns, for the most part, won. But it was Garretson who kind of made me even aware that that was a thing, right? Dr. Mosier made me aware. Sean McLean, Major McLean, all of these folks kind of influenced my thinking on this. And so to have Peter come out and say, okay, he's a blue water guy. Definitely he is. By the way, he had a very minor in the background role in the creation of Space Force. So hats off to him for doing that. He and Coyote Smith, Colonel Smith, and Lieutenant General Quast had some pretty significant background roles there. And so that's where he's coming from. So I want to make sure that everybody understands where he's coming from. So when he writes a document like this, you kind of know where he stands. And there's some pretty important stuff. He starts off with some fighting words. I like that. I like that about Pete, and I like that about how this document starts, right? SpaceX freed the U.S. government from the bonds of Russian space launch services by sending astronauts into space on American-made reusable rockets. That is so cool. And by the way, me, like a lot of other people, were watching. I mean, there was probably 1 million people online watching that first launch. And you know, the Russian launch services were charging. They started out charging $55 million per seat, and over time it moved up from $55 million to $60 to $70, and I think it ended at either $85 or $90 million per seat. So America was very much keeping the Russian launch services afloat for basically 10 years, from when the space shuttle was retired to when SpaceX launched people again from American soil. So yeah, 50, 60, 70, 90 million a seat per seat for 10 years. That's a lot of foreign exchange going into Russia that kept their program running. So that's the opening line here, and I gotta give hats off to Gerritsen about that. I think everybody who knows me, watches this show, has a pretty good handle on what Starship is and why it's important. Due to its reusability, size, and power, will dramatically improve access to low Earth orbit by yielding low-cost launches of payloads up to 100 metric tons. By the way, recently they announced 150 metric tons if you're willing to make it an expendable system. I don't know what you need to put into space that justifies that, but that is something they made an announcement about recently. But 100 metric tons. I'm just going to scan into the document for a second. There's something I want you to see. I love this graphic. I think this graphic should be everywhere. All right, so 450 metric tons for the ISS. 450. SpaceX wants to launch 100 metric tons per launch. They want to do it 3 times a day. That's a must quote. People have seen the show. I've shown that quote before. So you could launch the entire space station in a weekend. You could launch 600 metric tons in a weekend and have 150 tons to spare. That's how much this rocket is able to do, right? In the whole of humanity, we've only launched 18,000 tons. To give you some perspective, 100 tons is an aircraft carrier, so 20% of an aircraft carrier if you added everything anyone has launched since 1957, right? Anything anyone has launched since 1957 is only 20% of an aircraft carrier. But then if you're launching 3 times a day, 365 days a year, you're launching an aircraft carrier to space every year. That is mind-blowing. That is boggling to me. Like, I've been looking at this thing for 2 years now, and even now I keep being surprised by how big a deal this is. an aircraft carrier. I made in my paper, I wrote that we could launch a herd of elephant every day, a herd of elephant over the weekend. And I did some notes on how much does an elephant weigh and how many animals are in the herd. And to me, launching a herd of elephant is almost farcical. It's ridiculous. And yet here's Peter with an example that I think is actually even more accurate. It's kind of eloquent. Let's launch an aircraft carrier to space every year. It's just boggling. So I'm gonna jump back up into the document here. And there we go. You know, it's all about mass to orbit. I love this photo. I've seen this photo a bunch. You know, this thing is not fully reusable even now. There's going to be parts of it. So, yeah, pretty remarkable system. I don't really love these quote size comparisons. I don't know. I feel like they don't. This isn't the way I would characterize it. Yes, one is taller than the other. Yes, one is bigger than the other. But I think I like this number where you're looking at payload capacity. But I understand why they did it this way. So here's the thing I think that is super important: this refuelability. Everybody's been focusing on reusability, but refuelability is also a game changer, right? And I like this quote: reusability sets Starship apart from any other super heavy lift launch system. By comparison, NASA's SLS is fully expendable, meaning that every launch requires completely new engines, boosters, fuel tanks, capsules, and the like. An expensive and inefficient way of doing business. This goes directly to Garrettson's interest in, let's build a system that is efficient. And he's done some other work at the think tank that he works for, looking at what he refers to as budget dust, where he looks at NASA's budget, what's being spent, who's spending it, what are the missions for, and really kind of trying to hold NASA, and also he did the same thing with Space Force, holding them accountable to what their missions and mandates are. But it's this refueling element that I don't think is getting quite enough attention, and the ability to return. Now it's complicated. I don't want to simplify this. This is complicated stuff. You're going to have to send a bunch of starships up that are just fuel to move it from one system to another system. And NASA itself knows that we're not good at cryogenic refueling, cryogenic fuel transfer from one system to another system. This is not very well known and very well understood. So I want to make sure that people understand that while this document is talking about the near term wild blue yonder, a lot of this stuff is really, really unknown at this point. And I have firsthand experience to say material sciences is really challenging and you cannot schedule a breakthrough. So I like the refueling. I think it's important. It changes the whole system once you've got refuelability added with reusability. Like those two, like one of those things is good. Both of those things is revolutionary. I love this chart, and I'm kind of tired of seeing it. Um, uh, I like that this is where you are. I like the idea that this is where you're going. This is an estimated cost, but it's being estimated by Elon Musk himself. And we all know that while his team has a really great track record for engineering, Musk has a lot of tendency for hyperbole, and it gets him in trouble with the SEC, it gets him in trouble with Tesla, it gets him in trouble with Twitter, it gets him in trouble with SpaceX. Fortunately, it doesn't get him in trouble with SpaceX as often. So just because that's an estimated cost, given its source and his repeated hyperbole, while I'm not saying it's not going to happen, I'm going to say that I'd be really surprised if the price happened that quickly. I know they're trying to build an awful lot of starships, and there's indications they're going to launch from multiple sites, and so that definitely gives them some credibility, especially if they were able to launch from 3 locations, California, Texas, and Florida. That would allow them to do their 3 launches a day pretty easily. By the way, SpaceX did a turnaround in 17 hours from one launch to the next launch 2 weeks ago. So that's pretty remarkable. And then on a different coast, I think they did a launch within 7 hours of each other. 7 hours. Not the same facility, but it's just remarkable that they're measuring launch turnarounds in hours now. That gives me hope, and that gives some credence, some credibility to a graph like this, right? That the idea of $100 a pound, that's why I got into the space elevator business in the first place. That's it. $100 a pound. That was a task. That was a target. Well, you know what? Starship might do it. Starship might do it. And hats off to the team that accomplished that. The idea back in 2001, 2, and 3 of $100 a kilo to orbit, that was literal, actual science fiction working on the space elevator. So that we're actually pricing things at $1,600 a kilo right now for Falcon Heavy, for 3,000 kilos for a Falcon 9. That is amazing already. If we never did anything else, in rocketry, we just froze all the tech, and the rest of humanity had to rely on $1,600 to orbit, it was north of, it was 10,000. Sorry, I'm doing my conversions wrong. It was $20,000 to $25,000 per pound, 20 to 25,000. So, yeah, it's crazy that this is the world that we're living in currently, and the idea that it's going to go down to $100 a kilo. I just find that amazing and astounding. And I built my career on the idea of cheap access to space, and this seems to be the path. And I always said when I was working on the elevator that the elevator was going to be a footnote in history to all the other things that it enabled, and I stand by that. That if you can get these price points, the system that you do it with is not the thing that's going to make history. It's going to be all the things you do with it that make history. And I stick by that. I love that we're going to, really ramp up our access to the moon. Starship will enable a significantly more ambitious lunar program and facilitate substantially faster lunar industrial development. There are not very many people in the world that can talk about lunar industrial development with a straight face. Colonel Garretson, definitely one of those people that can do it with a straight face. He's been involved with all of the space policy documents at the industrial space base meetings, and he can talk about industrial development probably better than most people in the world can. The idea that depending on what the pricing is, that a lunar mission could be anywhere between 100 million and a billion, that's amazing, right? That means going to the moon becomes commonplace. Yeah, I like that idea. Here's the quote that I think is a little rough about Musk forecasting that within 2 to 3 years, a Starship might launch for just $10 million. So we had Robert Zubrin, Dr. Zubrin, the founder of the Mars Society, on our show maybe a month and a half ago. And he was saying, if that's a price point, people are going to start settling Mars at, $50,000, $100,000 per ticket. And at that point, people are going to sell their houses, they're going to get training, and they're going to go to Mars. So not only is this technologically a game changer, it also moves humanity to becoming a multiplanetary species. That's so amazing. I can barely get my brain around it. Again, I don't really believe in his time frames, but I do have confidence in his pricing. He's recently, I always hesitate to talk about the person versus the company. So let me clarify that. The company just raised their prices for Starlink by, they actually they changed their pricing. In some areas where they have extra coverage, they lowered their prices. In some areas where they have limited coverage, they raised their prices. So Starlink is now between $90 in high traffic areas and $110 in low traffic areas. So SpaceX is changing their pricing. They changed their pricing for Falcon 9. It's gone up from 5,000 per kilo to 6,000. That was 2021 into 22, and from 22 to 23, the price has gone from 5,500 to 6,500, which is different from this graphic, right? So so pricing, this graphic is not the whole story, and neither is the pricing that SpaceX just announced. But there is some argument that they're raising their prices to capture a premium place in the market. They don't really have a lot of other competitors. All of their competitors are, they've got full manifests for the next 15, 18, 24 months. So there's actually, not only is there not a glut on the market right now, there's actually scarcity. And that scarcity is driving the prices back up. So even though last year the world launched 1 million kilos to orbit, there still is not enough rocketry to support the demand. I think that's amazing. I think that's amazing. I'll show you a report here in just a minute. We're running out of time here. So here's the report. I definitely want you to take a look at that. I'm going to switch gears for a moment in my last 4 minutes of the show. This is Bryce. You know we've brought Bryce reports on several times here. This is their year in review, so 2020. Interesting, 1957 with the launch of Sputnik, year by year by year. And then this kills me. This is fantastic. Commercial spacecraft and launch vehicle, government procured commercial launch service versus government operated launch vehicles. So this would be by NASA for NASA. This would be NASA or Space Force buying a launch. And this would be SpaceX launching their own satellites. So I think that's pretty cool. I love that. I'm going to skip that one. And, well, I guess that's what I'm going to do. I mentioned this briefly. No, not this one, sorry. This one. Critical and Emerging Technologies List Update. So this came out last year, but they have specifically highlighted space in this document. It's the first time that I'm aware of. It's the first time that space has made the critical technologies list. These are the things that the White House is saying are important. Entry, descent, and landing, cryogenic fluid management. This right here in black and white, the Office of Science and Technology Policy at the White House is saying, we don't know how to do the thing that SpaceX is claiming that they're going to do. So right there in black and white from the administration, how do we get better at the thing that we must be able to do? Space propulsion. Everybody knows in space that you've got to do resilient position, navigation, and timing. And then finally, the first thing on their list is on-orbit service assembly and manufacturing. There's a document that the White House put out called ISAM, in space assembly and manufacturing. That's actually a better acronym because we're not going to just do stuff on orbit. We are also going to be doing stuff on the moon and outside of Earth's natural orbits. All right. And with that, I'm going to close down. Let me stop sharing. Okay, with that, I'm going to close down. Thanks everybody for being a part of the show. As always, I'm grateful to the audience, my team working really hard. It's good to have Taylor back. Rachel was on a trip to SpaceCon last week. Good to have her back. Jen's always terrific. Leah is celebrating her son's 10th birthday, so she's not on the show today, but glad she's having fun with her family. And we have a new intern going to be joining us in 2 weeks. So, you know, our team is growing. Yusuf is doing his work on our YouTube channel. So little by little, things are starting to kind of get a little bit stronger. We've got a long ways to go, but we're getting a little bit stronger. So the last couple of weeks have been good. All right. With that, thanks, everybody. I hope you have a great evening. 50-50 whether we're going to have a show on Monday and Wednesday next week, but I'm aiming for yes. So we'll see you soon. Take care. Bye-bye.